Hi, I'm Vian Trung. I am Senior Director of Engagement for Global Sustainability at Nike. I'm also on the Board of Directors at Ceres. I am so honored to introduce our next speaker and my friend, Bill McKibben. Bill is an author, a journalist, an educator, and environmentalist. His book, The End of Nature, is regarded as the first book for a general audience about climate change. He's also the co-founder of 350.org, the first global grassroots climate campaign. He's played a leading role in launching the opposition to big oil pipeline projects and the fossil fuel divestment campaign, among many other campaigns. In this World Series talk, Bill will explore how everything has coalesced to give us a chance for the 2020s to be a remarkable decade of bold action to tackle the climate crisis. The engineers have dropped the price of clean energy. The movement in the streets have cut the power of fossil fuel industries. Businesses and investors worldwide are waking up to the scale and the urgency of the climate emergency. So now we have 9 decisive years to make up for all the decades we have lost. It will take a powerful action on every front to cut global emissions in half by 2030 and to keep the world on the path to limiting global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. Bill, we look forward to your remarks.
Vian, thank you so much for that introduction. What a pleasure it is to be with all my friends at Ceres and everybody else for this important conference. We're at a really important moment right now in this climate question. And I can say that with some confidence because I've been around for most of the moments of that conversation, having written the first book about all of this back in 1989. So whether it was Kyoto or Copenhagen or Paris or many, many stops in between, I've gotten to watch and play my small role in how we got where we are. And it's not mostly a happy story, but it is at a promising moment right now. You're going to hear from my dear friend Gina McCarthy in a little while, and that's important because the advent of the Biden administration is a kind of marker on this road. And if there is anyone in the world that's well equipped to roll out a whole of government strategy, a real all hands on deck effort to see what we can get the federal government to do, it's Gina. She is important not only for her chops, policy chops, and bureaucratic skills, but for her willingness to be straightforward, even salty, in her understanding of our predicament. And here's how I define that predicament right now. Overt climate denial got on the airplane with Donald Trump to Mar-a-Lago, and it's not coming back. Hopefully he's not coming back, but it's not coming back. That part of this story is over finally. 30 years too late, and it could have been over 30 years ago. It's always worth remembering that when this story began, the Republican president, George H.W. Bush at the time, declared forthrightly that we would tackle the greenhouse effect with the White House effect. It wasn't a partisan issue until the oil industry decided to spend billions of dollars building this edifice of denial and deceit and disinformation that kept us locked in paralysis for 3 decades around the world. And what that means is that we now have to cram the work of 4 decades into one. It's not hard to figure out what the finish line looks like, at least in the next decade. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the authorities here, have told us in their last report in October of 2018 that if we had not fundamentally transformed our energy systems by 2030, which they helpfully defined as cutting emissions in half, then we had no chance of meeting the targets that we set just 6 years ago in Paris. They will go by the board. And we have a better sense now of what going by the board looks like. 2020 was the year of coronavirus, but if it hadn't been, it would have been the year of conflagration. We saw fires like we've never seen on this planet in human history, from Australia to Siberia, where the huge fires that kicked off last summer, some of them are still burning in the peat soils underneath the snow, to California and the West Coast, where we had governors telling people to stay in their homes and tape the windows shut against particulates, to South America, where the world's greatest wetland, the Pantanal at the border of Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay, 25% of it burned in the course of the fall, a wetland. That's a kind of small appetizer of what to expect as the temperature continues to increase. And of course, and this always, we've got to say, of course, the people who are hit the hardest are those who did the least to cause it. We had a record tropical storm year in the Atlantic basin. And the last two storms of the year, well into the Greek alphabet, Eta and Iota, crashed into the same part of Central America. The early estimate was the damage they'd done to the GDP of Honduras was equivalent to about 40% of that country's GDP. By contrast, Katrina, the worst disaster in our history, was equivalent to about 1% of our GDP. So nobody in Honduras did anything to cause any of this, and yet their lives are turned upside down, and so many lives turned upside down. So we're at the moment when we have to move with astonishing speed to make things happen. 9 years now till 2030. 9 years is nothing. It's 2 presidential cycles. It's about 35 quarters of in business terms. It's nothing. It requires an all-out effort if we're going to get things to happen. Happily, that all-out effort is possible in a way that it hasn't been at other points. 2 things have happened in the last decade that really matter. One, the engineers have done their job and they've dropped the cost of renewable energy, sun and wind in particular, and now batteries on the same curve, so far, so fast that these are the cheapest ways of generating power on our planet. We can and should cease burning anything, relying instead on the fact that the good Lord put a big burning orb in the sky about 93 million miles away, and we know how to take advantage of it in order to harvest the sun and the wind. At the very least, and right now, yesterday, we need to stop building anything new that eventually connects to a flame, because it is abundantly clear, as John Kerry said in one of his first announcements after taking office as GINA's international equivalent, that it makes no sense to build things that we're going to have to dismantle in short order. So the engineering is there. That's no longer the problem. The other thing that's happened over the last 10 years that potentially is of great significance is the construction of a movement, finally, where there wasn't one before. If you wonder why we made so little progress at Kyoto and Copenhagen, it's because, in part, there was no one to hold the politicians accountable for coming back with nothing. That's no longer the case. Not only do we have a movement now capable of holding politicians accountable, but capable of holding everybody else accountable too. Some of us helped start early versions of this with things like 350.org. Now this field is expanded to include Extinction Rebellion and the Sunrise Movement and Fridays for the Future and 1,000 others. It's probably the biggest movement in the planet's history, which is a good thing since this is the biggest problem we've ever faced as a planet. And that movement is increasingly savvy about how power works, savvy about how power works at a governmental level. You've seen the Sunrise Movement do extraordinary work in building the kind of coalition that brought Biden to power on a promise of quick climate action, among other things. It's a movement that understands that this needs to be a justice-focused, multiracial movement led by the most vulnerable frontline indigenous other communities. Also very savvy about how financial power is held and understanding that as important as Washington is, Wall Street's at least as important. I wrote a piece 2 years ago now called Money is the oxygen on which the fires of global warming burn. And it looked backwards at the work we'd done on divestment campaigning for the last 10 years. When we started that campaign in 2012, we had no idea that it would grow to become the biggest campaign of its kind in history. But here we are, $15 trillion in endowments and portfolios later. Institution after institution announcing it wants nothing to do with the fossil fuel industry, that it understands that it is not okay to try and fatten off the destruction of the planet. So looking back at that movement, which continues and grows, we get new divestments now almost every day. But looking forward too at the next ground for this activism, which has everything to do with the financial institutions, mostly, well, around the world, but in Tokyo, in London, above all in the United States. We understand the role that the banks have played historically in offering a financial lifeline to the fossil fuel industry. We understand the way that they've poured trillions of dollars into this industry since the Paris Accords. It didn't take Donald Trump to sabotage them. The easy and continued flow of financial support was enough to keep this industry healthy past the point where it should be, because we need to break the power of this industry so that it can no longer delay the movement towards a clean energy future. So understanding the significance of those insurance companies and asset managers and banks has been crucial. No one should think for a moment that there's anything naive or amateurish about the understanding that's emerged and the work that will be going forward. I got to confess that my last day out before the lockdown began was getting arrested with friends in the lobby of the Chase Bank nearest the nation's capital, with Jane Fonda on the other side of the glass cheering us on, because Chase Bank is the biggest of all of those lenders. And as we come out of the pandemic, you should know that this is one of the places, the financial community, where these movements will focus as they're able to retake the streets. There's no mystery about what needs to happen. That flow of funding needs to be cut off. And yet we continue to see it. Even as I talk to you today, the word came that a big new consortium of banks had floated a loan to a line of credit to Enbridge to continue building a massive pipeline, Line 3, across the upper Midwest. Yes, we beat the Keystone Pipeline after many years of hard work, and many thanks to the Biden administration for that. But it's the template for many other fights, all of which we can end if we can simply get out of the business of giving money to people who will use it to burn things. That's the easiest way to explain what has to happen. And it has to happen, and here I return to my original point, it has to happen fast. If you think sometimes that activists or bureaucrats are being too adamant, understand that it has nothing to do with anything other than the pace of change that physics and chemistry are now demanding. We do not have time. It is not like other political issues where you come back every few years and fight it out again, where incremental progress is good, where we make the kind of gradual changes that human economies and societies, and indeed individual human beings, are most comfortable with. That would be nice, but we do not have time for that, especially having wasted the last 30 years. The scientists are clear and articulate in their understanding that we have to move with exceptional speed, not to stop global warming, it's too late for that, but to stop it short of the point where it cuts off civilizations at their knees. That's our challenge, and that is our opportunity. We're finally beginning to seize that opportunity. One hopes that now we move with the speed that is the mirror of the sloth with which we've moved to date. And y'all will be supremely important in making that either happen or not happen. And the world will be watching, and history will be watching. This is the challenge for our time on this planet. Thank you.